So now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Robert C. Chandler is Professor of Communication and Director of the Nicholson School of Communication at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Chandler is also the Principal Researcher and Director of the Center for Crisis Communication at the Nicholson School. Dr. Chandler has studied crisis communication, leadership, teamwork, decision-making, psychometric variables during crises, and emergency communication. He has also reviewed specific areas of crisis and incident notification, warning messages, cognitive processing, and message comprehension. Dr. Chandler has developed several widely used planning models for crisis and emergency communication, including communication planning for the 6 stages of a crisis, the 3-3-30 principle for incident notification, the Chandler method of incident notification messages, and message mapping, the Chandler model. Dr. Chandler is an internationally recognized researcher with more than 150 academic and professional papers, including widely circulated white papers on emergency and crisis communication. His works have been published in more than 75 academic and scholarly journals, and he is the author or co-author of 8 books, including his most recent, Emergency Notification, in 2010. Dr. Chandler is a sought-after speaker, presenter, trainer, and seminar leader, and he hosts the annual International Crisis and Risk Communication Conference held every March in Orlando, Florida. After Dr. Chandler's presentation, we'll be hearing from Imad Moulin, Chief Technology Officer at Everbridge. Mr. Moulin is responsible for Everbridge's market strategy, product direction, and research and development. Mr. Moulin is a regular presenter at industry, technology, and academic conferences, including APCO, NEDRICS, the World Conference on Disaster Management, Interop, and the MIT CIO Symposium. He is frequently quoted in leading publications, including the New York Times, USA Today, BBC News, Business Week, Fortune, Forbes, Network World, and Information Week. Mr. Moulin is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has been awarded 4 U.S. patents. We are excited and honored to have both of our speakers here with us today. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Chandler. Dr. Chandler, you may begin.
All right, thank you, Erin, and thank you for inviting me to join us, and I'm looking forward to today's session. Always looking forward to working with Imad, and so the first thing I always promise him is that I won't use up all the time on him as I talk. I think this is just a fascinating topic. It's innovative and very forward-thinking, and so I was delighted when you invited me to share with us on the idea of not just social resiliency, but individual and people resiliency, as well as thinking about communication, and as we begin to move to the next phase of managing a response to an event or an incident. And so I'm actually kind of thrilled with this. It's most certainly a big topic, and so I will certainly do injustice to it in just a 20-minute talk. But let me just raise a couple of things. We think of resiliency in society. And of course, resiliency is the idea of strengthening something that makes it increase and enhance its ability to manage, bounce back from, recover from whatever has threatened it. And we think about resilient society. Obviously, at one level, we think about macro processes and infrastructure and procedures and networks of people. But also, it's at the individual level. And so building resiliency in society really is built upon the building blocks, the smaller pieces of building individual resiliency. And yes, people are stressed. Obviously, any kind of an incident, whether it's very localized in an office or whether it's a regional disaster, a crisis, a threat, wildfire, floods, active shooters, the world is a dangerous place. And certainly different people react differently to those events. And so when we first asked the question, what do ordinary people do, or how do they behave, or what do they think when they're stressed by these kinds of events, and how do they react? I mean, the first answer, and I apologize if it sounds academic, is that, well, everyone's different. Not everyone automatically reacts identical to everyone else. People are just too diverse, and we all bring different life experiences, preparation, and training, even if we've not specifically been trained for a situation. And so diversity in response is certainly the first truth. However, we've researched crowd and individual response during these events now. In fact, there's a continuous unbroken line of research that dates back about 75 years. It actually began with studies during the Second World War to look at people in London when they were under the threat of the Blitz, the bombing, the London, the battle for London, battle for Britain, when their homes were blown up. They were chased out of their homes by air raid sirens, living in the tubes underground, and they began to look at what kind of things led to resiliency. And that research that was begun at that point has really continued, and so there's lots of research. One of the things that I will say right at the offset is that research has at least taught us that, I'm going to label it the myth of the War of the Worlds response, that in fact there is no documented evidence that people shut down. If you remember the War of the World, and usually I have a student or someone in an audience ask me about that, about they heard the George Orwell's story, the War of the Worlds, and it was broadcast on the radio in the 1930s. And of course, some of the anecdotes are that some people were so frightened and terrified by hearing the radio show that they literally ran out their doors and left stuff on the kitchen stove and you know, food on the pot and plates on the table, and just ran into the night. And I've heard so many accounts of this from different people that basically say, well, and they were never heard from again, and they completely freaked out. But the reality is that actually panic or sort of losing one's mind to fear and losing all rationality is not a common reaction to crisis. People don't just shut down and go screaming off into the night in some sort of insanity sort of issue. Certainly there are people out there who react with episodic issues, but the myth of just everyone just panics and that sort of thing is just simply not true. In fact, different people react differently, and we've actually got now a nuanced set of reactions. Some people engage, some people discuss. Information hunger is something that we know. People crave more information, what's going on. Many people want to share their perceptions. And so we know that people in these situations react differently. And a sizable number of them not only keep their cognitive senses about them, but they actually, in fact, by sort of disregarding trivial issues, by cutting off lots of other stuff they had, worrying about what's for lunch or whatever was cluttering their mind, a lot of people become actually focused and very intently committed to events. And so different people react differently. And today I just want to focus on some groups of them for what people tend to do and how that might play a role in what we're happening. So some horrible thing begins to happen. There are those who don't just kind of walk like zombies away from a situation or just run screaming into the night. We look at the testimony of those who are around horrific events, and certainly tragedy, horrific things that I think we would believe would just shut people down. But in fact, we find that people are quite, certainly groups of the segments that we study are quite resilient about these things and can step up. And you say, well, somebody will be turned off by horrific injuries or something. We find that people actually go towards them and try to offer first aid and do things that even they themselves will comment later. But, it had to be done. I just, don't call me a hero. It had to be done. Someone had to step up. Someone had to knock the gun. I remember doing an interview a few years back about a shooter that entered a city hall meeting, and a woman who used her purse to beat the gun out of his hand. And they said, "What, are you crazy or something?" She goes, "No, it needed to be done, and that's the only thing I had in my hand." People are capable of some really remarkable things. And we've done a lot of research with physiology and psychology with trying to understand why they do these things. And it certainly is very much the idea of people getting involved to an incident. And people who are there often keep their, how do I say this politely, they keep their wits about them. They stay tuned in, and they do have information hunger, and they do want to share, and they do want to help. In fact, action motivations are very, very common, is do something. We find that to be consistent across a great deal of the literature research, that people have an action need. Let me do, I have to do something. In fact, some of our greatest frustrations come when someone says there's nothing I can do, and that was particularly frustrating to me during this particular event. And you find someone saying, "I've got to help," and often people will put themselves at risk. Now, let me just pause here. I do not encourage anyone to put themselves at risk. I think that prudence and good judgment and keeping yourself healthy and able to respond is the only way you're ever going to be able to help anyone else. I'm not an advocate for people to engage in high-risk behaviors, and that's not my point, and I don't want to be misunderstood for that. Nonetheless, the evidence indicates that there are people who do stay on site, who do try to give directions, who make the 911 calls, who begin to engage an event and do things that can be remarkably helpful, especially as long as they, the information gets to the right people and it gets disseminated. Of course, now we're back to a communication issue, which is why I'm here today, because that is an area that I'm very interested in. And so what about communication during these times? And without making people, try to walk over and interview the active shooter, what are some of the things that can happen in terms of tapping this kind of potential? And I think it's a fascinating question. I do think that the idea that people are engaging in these events and they become yet another resource is a fairly new way of looking at the situation. I think in the past, emergency response, law enforcement, disaster management and recovery, I think a lot of us coming from different angles have looked at people as something that's in the way. Or we've assumed they're all emotionally distraught and worthless, and they're something else that we have to care for. And we do need to care for people that need counseling and physical first aid, psychological first aid, obviously, but just treating them as yet another task, I think, is old school. And what I'm excited about with thinking through this topic is that there is a whole new way of framing people, not as the problem or the burden or the task, but actually framing them as a resource for information, a resource for action, a resource for feedback, a resource for surveillance. There's a lot of things that I think people, what they're naturally doing in the modern context, especially with modern technology, that we ought to really think about how really up close they are and how that they are eyes and ears. People react to sudden things. Probably the evacuation studies are a wonderful subsection. If you're just curious, read about why people do what they do when the alarm sounds. And one of the things they don't do is just immediately, like automatic robots or automatrons, get up from their seats and their workstations and their assembly lines and walk in quiet uniform lines to their evacuation assembly point. If your planning is assuming that's what people are going to do, we need to talk about this. In fact, the percentage of people who ignore fire alarms is just stunningly remarkable. The kind of effort you have to do. And why is that? It's because people are thinking it through. Is this, is this really serious? Or don't you know how busy I am? Or I don't think there's a real fire. And even if they think that, many of them will begin to investigate it. Here in my own context, when we have a fire alarm, here at our main office in the School of Communication, I'll have faculty and staff and students and workers call and say, is this a drill or is this for real? Which is an absurd thing to be doing when the alarm's going off, because as any fire safety officer would tell you, or floor warden, is that you're putting yourself at risk by doing it, but yet people do that. Information hunger. A lot of research since 9/11 showed that people will spend the largest amount of their time when the alarm sounds not getting out of the building, not putting all their effort and energy to getting out, but to trying to talk to others, check with others, call others, investigate, try to learn more information. Is there a drill schedule? What is going on? Or even fundamental questions like, where is our assembly point again? And people will spend their time. And so what you don't like is the idea when a fire alarm goes off that people are pulling notebooks off of their shelf, trying to flip through and trying to find where was my assembly point, or is this for real? The reaction is, though, that people do remain calm. They do seek information, and they do seek to provide information. And that is a phenomenon that a certain percentage of people will do. And sometimes human behavior surprises us because it's not what we would expect. So if you have people who are in this information mode, people who are not panicking, they're not becoming zombies, nor are they strictly following their cheese trail to their assembly point or something. It does give us an interesting question. So we've got a lot of people, and in the modern context, all of those people now are more connected than ever. And the question is there a way to keep people safe and also to leverage their tendencies and the new existing technologies to become part of managing an event? Is it a way of helping us communicate about the event? Are there ways that we can think about that, just quite honestly with you? When I started doing my research in this area back in the early 80s, would never have occurred to me as a possibility for this. But we are now at this idea of saying, can we get them to build not only their own resiliency, give them, can we use their tendencies of seeking information, wanting to share information and provide it, and put it to better uses? Can we take the idea of, I want to do something, I have to do something, I want to be, I can't stand here nor can I walk away from this event, and actually the idea of, I want to learn more, tell me what's going on, and what role can we think about now for people on a what is it, crowdsourcing is the new phrase. I guess this is a corollary to that. This is sort of, is there a way of utilizing a crowdsourced approach to understanding what's happening, where it's happening, how severe it is, and also to get people reporting. You know, we've relied on the 911 dispatcher, and I could give you lots of reasons why that is so indirect that it's a long loop, and we also some terrible stories about the failures of 911. But is there a way of doing it? And again, my point is not that everyone should become an emergency responder, and I don't want that to be sort of a takeaway here. The question is, this is there. It is a latent resource that exists, both in terms of human behavior, human potential, as well as access to all of this. Is there a way to then leverage that? That's merely my question. Is there a way to leverage that to the advantage? And so it's really beginning to say, is there something about this that gives us a unique advantage? And let's just start by thinking about the idea of quite literally, where are the first eyes and ears on the ground for an event? And we may think, well, it's the news reporters. They've driven their van there and they've set up, and now I can get the latest information from CNN. Well, the challenge here is that if you wait for the CNN news cycle, or you wait for local Channel 9 to get their news trucks there, you're often not utilizing the quickest, the most firsthand types of reporting. You're actually caught in an incredible time delay, where we talk about time being of essence. You know, we used to talk about golden hours. Now we talk about golden minutes, and I'm quite certain we're very close to talking about golden seconds for doing things. How can we speed information and get it there? And so, is it really the news media, or actually, is there another source of getting firsthand reports that is coming long before even the first law enforcement responders get there, long before the first public safety officer is able to submit a report? Is there a source? And I just opened that up for thinking about it, and quite initially, to me, the obvious place to start this conversation would be to look at social media, for example. And so one of the earliest reports and visual images and information from the Asiana jetline accident at SFO is, of course, coming from reposted, retweeted, posted pictures. And so someone who gets out of the plane, turns around, snaps a picture. Now that image, some sense of understanding of what's happening is there. It's available. And this is someone who has not put themselves in harm's way by going back in to get an interior shot, but this is someone who's giving us firsthand knowledge. And we have beaten the news. We have beaten the press. We have beaten the formal reporting chains. There's been no press release. We've had no information coming from law enforcement or the fire department. I mean, this is still an active alarm situation, and yet we're beginning to have this information available. Now, do we leverage it? Do we tackle it? I think that's some of the fun questions. This leads into a topic that I've talked about before, but we look at situational intelligence, and situational intelligence is sort of the next step up from situational awareness. Obviously, Situational awareness tells us that we grab everything we can around us to know at any given moment what's happening, and we take that into account. Intelligence is a more dynamic process of gathering all of the informational inputs that are available, finding a way to synthesize them, manage them, because information overload is just as bad as information underload. And we interpret that and then use that to not only inform others, to make our decisions, but also to seek further information. Who do we need to ask? What is the thing we're missing? Which way is the fire moving? Which is it? Is it the corner intersection where the power substation is or not? I mean, the kind of questions that are so critical. We may be able to get faster than putting somebody in a truck and having them drive across town and find out. And that's sort of what I'm suggesting here, is that we've entered a new realm of leveraging a source of surveillance, a source of information, a source of feedback that is, in a sense, a crowdsourced, a widespread source, and it's something to begin to think about in terms of real-time interaction. And I think it's kind of exciting to think in that way. I believe that social media resources, this wealth of information that's out there, is a great source for valuable, timely, and situational information, but it's only valuable if it's harnessed and if it's done appropriately and correctly. Here in Florida, we make a big deal about solar energy. We have lots of sunshine. It's a very warm day today. Blue skies, sunshine. There's a lot of energy out there, and if you don't have a way to capture that energy, to convert it appropriately, to do it safely, to harness it, get it onto the grid, then it's gone. It's wasted. And so in some ways, there's this wonderful resource, information resource, feedback resource, eyes and ears on the ground, that is this great, wonderful thing. Now, you can have bad solar panels and not get it very efficiently. Some don't work, and some of it is just simply not usable. And there are times that, you know, I can push my metaphor too far here, but there are times where the energy is less reliable, whether it's a cloud overhead or something. I mean, certainly, it doesn't mean this is a magical panacea. I'm not naive enough to think that. But as I sit back and look at it, from a communication and information standpoint, there is an entire sea of this. There's a solar system of this kind of information that is out there that could answer so many of our questions so much quicker and provide us double checking, fact checking, and find us real-time information. I mean, that's probably one of the things that any of us have been through an event understand, that particularly in the early stages of an event, misinformation completely outnumbers information. And that's been something we've dealt with decade after decade, trying to figure out what to do. I think there is now a new opportunity to look at ways of enacting that. So when you're following an event, you know, where do we learn about it? How do we know? Is it, you know, we've used sort of the traditional methods of notifying the authorities and law enforcement, and then it works through its cycle. And I grew up in an era where you had a police scanner and tried to keep up with when things were happening and things. But right now, that seems so outdated. It feels like papyri in a modern digital world. You look at it, so we look at an instance of an active shooter. You know, where is this resource? Where do we learn this stuff? Interestingly enough, the stories now break. They break on Twitter. It really boggles my mind. I'm of a certain generation, but I have to really stop and take a breath and understand that we've gone through a sea change moment. We're now in a world where you know, the first inkling of the raid on Osama bin Laden is our Twitter post. It boggles my mind how real time and how efficient it is. Now, that's both good and bad. I mean, that certainly for secrecy, that's a bad thing. But for those of us that realize that this resource is out there, and we feel it's important to have real time, fast alerting to us, so we in turn can take other steps of alerting our people, monitoring social media, monitoring these sites where everybody is saying, hey, there's a guy walking around in front of our office with a gun shooting, finding that out, and whether it's, you know, gunmen, shots, hostages, our building, there may be things to look for in particular, and listening to reports, who's where. We worry so much about confirmation, about who's safe, who's moving, being in touch with people. Right? Sending email to inboxes that won't be read for another day is really pointless. Leaving voice messages that will never be heard is frustrating. But the idea of the connected generation in terms of communicating, both in terms of gathering information in two-way, I think is of vast potential. I think that leveraging what people are already doing, leveraging their connection and involvement. And again, I'm not asking you to go to the window and take a picture of the gunman. I guess I'm pointing out people are already doing that. The question is, without encouraging this, what can I do to leverage the fact that there is posted on social media right now on his MyFrog account, what's happening? And I think that's kind of the gaze of this. So we're going through this moment where we're really changing how we look at how we learn about events. And even if you're someone of my generation that still kind of goes home and watches the evening news, even the images on the evening news are being sourced differently now. And I find, again, a remarkable change that even the mainstream media news sources now are relying more and more on this, because I think it's a tacit acknowledgement that it's there, that these folks are there quicker than flying a news crew or driving a news crew over or going to try and interview people or waiting for the official channels of communication. Now, should it replace it? I don't think so. I don't think that mainstream media will stop sending investigative reporters out. I just don't see that. I don't think they'll abrogate that role. Should it supplement it? Well, it already is. I think that decision's already been made. So the question for us is, do we replace our traditional lines of communication and information processing? Well, no, I don't think that's the call here at all. I think the call is to be forward-thinking and really demonstrating over the curve types of best practices, is that we supplement it with a new source of information that really gives us advantage. And so looking at all of these things, obviously it increases the amount of information. Now that's an interesting question. I already mentioned information overload. You have to have some means of sorting and sifting, otherwise you just drown in trying to read 4 billion tweets on a topic. I do think that it evolves. I think if I give this same presentation 2 years ago, it looks very different than what I'm doing today, and I think in 2 years it will look very different as to what kinds of social media, what things. So it has to be moving. It's a moving target. It has to be ongoing and continuous evolution. Of course, one of the exciting things is that it also allows for the idea of looking for these common threads. So maybe it's a particular location, a neighborhood, outside of a plant, an airport. It's a particular place, or it's a particular group of people that are affected by it. And I think that for every one of us, and we've got about 350 or so different types of companies and groups represented today. So it's hard for me to give one example that fits all. But if you think of the applications of how social media could provide an additional leverage resource. And the fun thing is that the tools are now here, that this is not just a pipe dream. This is something that we can begin to integrate into what we're doing and making the connection. And I think that's kind of a lot of fun. Now, let me be honest, it's not simple. I don't think this is a genie in a bottle type solution. I did mention the sheer volume of information, and I think if you just dive in, there's a terrible risk of just being paralyzed by information overload. The other question that I think has to be confronted, this is one my students ask me and people in seminars, isn't there also extraneous information out there? Isn't there malicious information? And my answer is yes. It would be naive to think that people with various agendas or want to spend something or blame somebody don't, manipulate it. And to be honest with you, even if they weren't deliberately manipulating, I do enough research on perception and opinion bias and different things that some people see stuff differently. So you have to have some ways of filtering it, and I think you have to use common sense. And I would also remind you, I think tapping this particular energy and information energy resource doesn't mean that you disconnect everything else you're doing. It always should be cycled through. If I can use a word from the land surveyors, I would suggest triangulation, that you can't do it just on one point. You've got to use some other measurements in order to know what's happening. And I think I mean, I think vigilance is, I never would advocate you're not vigilant and keep using your head. The question is, could this be useful? You know, I point to Hurricane Sandy. I actually believe that was the watershed moment, watershed for floods. I usually say sea change, but that one also doesn't work really well with Sandy. But I do believe that Sandy was our first fully social media disaster, and that everything since then really falls into the new era of these things live on it in terms of the amount of information that's moving around, of tweets and resources and intelligence and reconnaissance, also in terms of people being communicated to. And it's visual. It's the videos being posted. It's the photos available to you. If you want to see what's happening on any event, social media is now your eyes and ears. You know, we used to talk about wearing cameras all over society. I know the UK did a lot of that. It's ironic, but we didn't wire the whole world with cameras, and suddenly we pretty much got visual images of just about anything when it happens. Lots of videos, thousands of videos on Sandy. Everything from flooding areas, closed roads, to which gas stations were open came through in the social media world. It is the new reality of trying to manage it. And I do think at a very large level. I also think that the thing that's exciting, if any of you have heard me teach my full in-depth seminars on communication success, know that there's a lot of communication quality issues that improve communication. Asynchronous versus synchronous, rich media, lean media. I have a lot of different things that I try to raise people's awareness that it's just, you know, just one email text doesn't always do it. One of those things that I always talk about is two-way communication. And just think about it in terms of a dialogue. If somebody just sends you a message versus sits down and talks to you about it, how much more enriching, informative, fewer misunderstandings, more correction on misinformation comes about. And so improving quality is often looking at something like a two-way. And I do think that's one of the things about social media that gets dialogue started, conversations started. And in some ways, these have corrective influences. So if you were worried about, you know, something being misinformation or misstatement or something, one of the nice things about a lot of the social media is it has its own internal sort of corrective, like, no, wait a minute, you know, that it's not a fire, it is a fire. You know, here I have a picture of the explosion. It's interesting how there is self-correction going on, and I think that's something else that can be taken advantage of. And of course, interaction goes with any sort of discussion that's happening in terms of whatever the event is, however serious it is, and getting that kind of bouncing back and forth is something that's now available to us. We can begin to monitor people as they're discussing what's happening, and it's, in a sense, I was going to say eavesdrop, but certainly rely upon that. So this is one aspect of it, and I do want to just, I want to leave that for just a minute because I have one more thing to do, and then I do want to turn this over and let Imad share some really exciting things in terms of tools and instrumentation. I do use this metaphor. It's this vast, like solar energy is for energy needs, this vast information is just out there glowing. And the real question is that we need some method to capture, filter, and then a process to analyze and utilize this information, to engage in two-way communication, to both listen and to learn from. And so it's a listening and learning thing. And so on a big macro level, I'm talking about a public crowdsourcing engagement with this. But we also need to cultivate a much smaller community. We need to get some specialized connections that come much closer to mimicking our old traditional communication networks and upgrade those and how we utilize those. And I guess that's the second part of this, by getting some connected private sources or close community sources. And I think within that closer community, that's where your rich, complex multimedia connection with you know, the local hospital infrastructure, if that's relevant to your area. Your own employees very much connected. First responders connections, first reporters, first handlers, people in the community, your volunteer base. Again, I mean, we're talking to almost 350 different types of organizations here. So you should think of your own list for your closer in private networks and building a relationship with those people. So on one level, we have this macro need, for lack of a better word, my apologies, this whole giant mass crowdsourced resource, but also building more complex communication relationships with members of the community that you communicated to. Now, this should even have a higher level of validity and reliability of information. You should have higher levels of trust. Credulity problems that you might have with a random tweet would be less. These are people who are also more motivated because you're sharing specific information much quicker in real time. And it's this sort of connection, and I know my clock is running here, but I do think we also cultivate this smaller circle as well as this more universal circle. And so once we get people who are connected and they're actually utilizing behavior of citizens out on the street during these life cycles, we begin then to see how they can be utilized as part of it. We were already beginning to do that in public digital signage and responses. And I love the example here of the Amber Alerts. We here in Florida have just had 3 major statewide silver alerts, and that for us is when the old people get in their cars and drive off and they can't find them. All of these kinds of things of getting people involved, tweeting it, reporting it, it should speed up our ability to manage these types of things in terms of closer real-time adjustments and movement and routing and getting people in and out. All of the challenges that we face in communication, I think the value of having people connected as both an information resource, as our eyes and ears, and also connecting and correcting. Updating. I always use the ripple in the pond analogy. Too much of our communication goes out like ripples in a pond, and what we need to do is be able to have a smart ripple to guide it, to adapt it, to change it, to bounce back on it, and I think that's really what we're looking for with this. So my points are really is that I think people have capacity to be resilient. I think many are. I don't want to stereotype. Not all people are the same. But I think they're desiring to get involved in a crisis. And I think we ought to find ways to both help them find an outlet for that as well as utilize what they're already doing. And certainly, to me, the most glaring place to start, and this is a much longer conversation, has to do with information. The second is the ability to leverage that resilience to help us create systems of situational intelligence. Let's organize our approach to social media. Let's begin to focus on personal communities and specific groups in those. And, of course, dialogue. A conversation is always better than a one-way situation. And finally, we have to turn to look at making sure that we're getting the best methods and tools for accomplishing this, and that is to filter through a voluminous amount of information and content and have a system and process in place to quantify and analyze it and do it quickly and have it self-correcting and worry about validity and reliability. And through that resilience, everyone becomes part of the solution, and we treat them as part of the solution and no longer as part of the problem of how to get them out of our way or how to deal with their panic, which is not really happening or anything else. And that's really my point, and I'm excited about that. Let me, Imad, I'm going to pass it over to you, and I've tried to expedite here, but I'm very eager for hearing the next step for those of us that really say, hey, this is a good idea, but how do you do it?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chandler. I think, as always, I'm pretty excited to hear all the in-depth information that you have to share with us. But first, what I wanted to do is just a big thank you and a shout-out to David. David, you joined us from New Zealand. What time did you wake up? 3 a.m.? It's, what, 4 a.m. right now? So that shows some commitment. So hopefully we can make this worthwhile. And obviously, with the incredibly in-depth information that Dr. Chandler gave us, we started, I think, in the right direction. So let's see where we left off with Dr. Chandler, right? Again, nobody's condoning or encouraging people to run towards the fire or the gunshot, but people have a tendency to go out there and try to help. So how do we help the people who are there helping others in case of a crisis? How do we leverage the information that they may have at their fingertips? How do we leverage the information that we are gathering from all of these people who are out there in front of the situation to help those people who help themselves? Again, this is where having the right methodology, the right tools, the right processes really comes in. So let's go back and talk about situational intelligence and how, again, it differs from the typical situational awareness. And typical situational awareness, what you're gathering as much as possible is the information that's available to you. And traditionally, what's been done up to now is gathering it through the more traditional sources and feeds of information, news media feeds, information from local public safety agencies, potentially even weather feeds. That information that tends to be fairly structured, that comes from a limited number of different feeds. The idea behind situational intelligence is to actually combine it with the collective intelligence of the masses, information that might be coming at you from a variety of different sources incredibly quickly from the people who are there really at the scenes, people who are closest to the situation. So yes, that includes, in some cases, social media, public forums, etc., information that's being volunteered by people who happen to be as close to the situation as you can get, which obviously, as Dr. Chandler mentioned, comes with pros and cons. You might get a lot more timely information, a lot more of it, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, and a lot of it can be erroneous, contradictory, etc. The idea behind collective intelligence is you can actually sort out all of the issues and separate the wheat from the chaff, the signal from the noise, and figure out as quickly as possible what it is that the information is telling you without necessarily having it be affected or impacted by the negative or contradictory information. So when you put the situational awareness with the collective intelligence together, you get to this panacea of situational intelligence that can help you in these cases as much as possible. So let's talk a little bit about the inputs to situational intelligence, and they can help us with the resiliency of the citizen response. So the big idea here is to gather information from a variety of sources, augmenting what you typically get from your typical situational awareness sources. So certainly social media is going to be a big part of that. Gathering information from these very, very public forums where a lot of people can certainly publish information that may or may not be correct, factual. Augmenting that with information that can come from your own personal communities that might be smaller in numbers, but certainly more credible because you certainly have helped create or have a much more direct relationship with these communities. And then in either situation, engage in two-way communication, because that's absolutely key in these cases, whether it's to help direct people towards the right opportunities, the right points, whether it's to help you gather additional information or direct resources to where they can do the most good. So a couple examples here from just piggybacking on some of the information that Dr. Chandler shared with you as far as gathering information during Hurricane Sandy. Some of the really hot spots weren't necessarily about the actual storm itself, but about the aftermath. In this particular case, it was about gas shortages. And you could see, based on the little cluster and clutter of those little orange pins, where people are tweeting from as far as this particular topic is concerned, which was all around gas. So you could see now that a lot of what people were concerned about in certain locations was not only the gas shortages, but potentially the very, very long lines that were presenting themselves, hindering people, and allowing people to potentially figure out where the best place to go would be in order to get gas. So that can also alert the authorities, alert businesses as to the issues that citizens in general, their employees would be having. So that can have an impact on everything from business continuity and making sure that you have a way to get people back to work, to making sure that you have the right people directing traffic in the appropriate locations, even before the situation gets worse. In some cases, it can also give you insight into one particular situation that you can see replicated in a variety of different places. So having images on this from the scene of a particular incident as a follow-up, in this case a fallen tree or whatnot, can help direct resources to the appropriate location and help show people what to avoid when there's an overall issue. Without this two-way capability, without this harnessing capability, it would be much more difficult to gather, certainly as quickly as possible, all the factual information about where particular issues might be happening. Again, the issue that we've mentioned before is if you rely solely on social media, you've got to be able to do it and do it right. And simply because you're going to be confronted with a huge amount of information that might be completely, shall we say, inconsistent, contradictory, not factual. So part of having the right tools is having first the appropriate methodology. We call it monitor, analyze, and notify. You want to be able to monitor the right sources of information, analyze it as quickly as possible to determine whether there is something there of interest, and then make sure that when a particular threshold is triggered, that the right people are notified so that they can come and do something about it. And again, notifying the right people might be as small a team as, say, people who are in charge of emergency management or business continuity, or it could be as large as all of the people in an impacted area if there is something that's life-threatening or a change in a situation that requires a much more consistent, a much more reliable way of letting people know that there is an action to be undertaken than simply posting it onto Twitter. When you absolutely positively have to get to people and account for them, you want to hook up that communication capability to this monitoring and analysis capability. So what is it that you're monitoring? Well, you can actually monitor a variety of different input feeds. In the case of Twitter, for example, what you want to look for is anything that shows you that there is an abnormal pattern or a change in the pattern. So, for example, what you're looking for is a higher than normal volume of tweets for certain keywords or certain hashtags. And that could be either generally speaking or within a particular geographic area. And as soon as the volume itself goes above a certain number, well, you want to say, look, there are a lot of people talking about these particular keywords or hashtags more so than usual. I want to know about it as quickly as possible. But it could also be the change in the makeup of what's going on in that conversation. So one of the easiest ways of doing that is simply saying, look, if there is a higher than normal percentage of a particular keyword or set of keywords within a particular hashtag, then and only then do I want the system to pay attention. And again, the idea is that all of this is done automatically. There's no human intervention that's involved. In the case that I've showed you here, potentially what I'm looking for is that over 5% of the tweets for hashtag tornado have the word touchdown on them. So if a lot of people are sharing this information, well, I want to be able to pay attention to it. I want the system to flag it, to alert it, to call the appropriate people, to text them, to email them, to make sure that the right information is in the hands of the people, because people now out there are talking about not just tornado in general, but an actual touchdown somewhere. So again, there's a difference here between simply saying, monitor all of this information that's out there, and then saying, analyze it for me. Show me the differences in the patterns. Show me the different clusters. Clusters that can be geographic in nature, showing a trail or a path of a particular event that's moving towards my location, or a lot of people in one particular location discussing the exact same topic, a topic that is of importance to me, right? That is what the analysis is all about. That is the harnessing of the collective intelligence. If enough people find that that particular piece of information is important, they will retweet it, they will empty it, they will modify it, talk about it, and that can be part of your trigger to see that, what, there is a piece of information that's critical to me. I will go and look at it, and I will ignore anything that basically hasn't picked up any steam out there in the Twitterverse. So again, that's part of the overall analysis after you've done your monitoring. It can all be automated. But what's key, again, is to be able to hook it up so that it automatically notifies the appropriate people. Now, as far as notifying people, what you have to be able to do is also do that on the go. Part of what we saw, for example, during some of the Boston Marathon events, the post-events, the manhunt, etc., is that a lot of the coordination that was done in certain surrounding towns to, for example, to do the manhunt, the door-to-door search, etc., a lot of the coordination was done literally from the streets as the police force was moving from one street to the next, making sure that the appropriate notifications to specific geographic area was conducted with, say, fewer resources, because you could see exactly what was happening because you were on the street right there, seeing what was going on, getting reports right away as to who's actually gotten a notice to either evacuate or stay put, and then adjusting really in real time. And again, that's just a precursor to engaging in two-way communication. Two-way communication certainly can be done via social media as long as you have the ability to harness this huge amount of information coming back. But it can also be done specifically with individuals that are part of that community that Dr. Chandler mentioned. Again, these could be your employees, these could be your first responders, these could be people that you're directing to be somewhere for the purposes of actually helping out. If you have a large business with offices everywhere, these can be people who are on the front lines within the offices showing you exactly what's happening when an event is impacting one of your facilities or events, one of your facilities or offices, whether in one country or worldwide. In that particular case, letting them not only respond to messages with as much detail as possible, with the ability to include pictures, with the ability to have their location tagged automatically is absolutely key, but they can also send you unsolicited messages. For example, whether they're checking in when they're traveling somewhere or where they're reporting for the first time an overall issue, that's part of your more trusted network where you require fewer people corroborating the information before you'll believe it, as opposed to requiring potentially a larger number of people corroborating the information or giving you a different perspective on the same issue. So in this particular case, the information is coming back to you. It's completely geotagged. It's got the additional information such as a photo of the actual situation, all coming back to you within the exact same environment. So and the key behind leveraging this resiliency of citizens is to be able to grab all this information in one place so you can make the appropriate decisions. Whether it's that automatic analysis of social media with all its corroborating information and the ability to automatically shed information that's suspect, to the information coming back to you from those closed communities that you create, that you manage, with a much richer two-way communication that includes geotagging of the responses and the unsolicited message, or other more traditional information that may be coming to you that describes to you the situation at hand, such as potentially the weather feeds, etc. The key is to have all this information in one place so you can act, and in this case, direct resources, order an evacuation, do what needs to be done in order to make sure you're saving lives and livelihoods. So, going back to resiliency in general, right? It takes many forms. There are people who will not run away from the front lines. There are citizens who are willing to help the first responders. There's obviously first responders themselves that are out there. What's key here is to have as much information as possible so you can make the right decisions and push information out to people who are out there, because it can make all the difference in the world to make sure that you're not leading people towards the wrong event or the wrong direction. But what you need are the appropriate tools to take advantage of this enormous amount of information, separate that signal from that noise, come up with just what you need, and have it in as timely a manner as possible. So hopefully you'll be able to take a look at the Everbridge platform that contains and offers up these capabilities, both in terms of notifying people, whether you're dealing with a team of 10 people or you're dealing with a community of 10 million people. You have this ability with mass notification to communicate in both ways, both directions, with groups large and small, manage incidents appropriately with interactive visibility, giving you the ability to really harness situational intelligence by doing the social media monitoring, the two-way mobile member community building and communication in general, and include multiple feeds to give you as much situational intelligence as possible, all of that leveraging a variety of mobile apps so that when you're on the go, you can not only have access to all this information, but allow it to be done in both directions. All of that sits on top of the Everbridge platform, since ultimately what you need to be able to do is trust the information and the platform that you're relying on when things are critical. So other than that, I'd like to thank you very much for attending. We certainly look forward to answering a few of the questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much. Open it up to questions and answers. So just as a reminder, you may submit your questions by typing it into the open text field in the questions panel on your screen and submitting to all panelists. So we'll answer as many questions as time allows. So our first question is, how does gathering citizen information impact the ability to keep communication systems from being overloaded?
I'll take that one if you don't mind, Dr. Chandler. So the first and foremost, whether it's gathering the information itself or notifying the citizens, it's something that you absolutely have to do in times of a crisis across the board. And yes, in some cases, it might add more burden to the overall infrastructure, but the key is to do it judiciously, to do it in the right way. First and foremost, one thing that we always see here at Everbridge is that no single method of communicating with people is ever going to be 100% reliable 100% of the time. So what you have to be able to do is contact people in multiple ways, so that if there is a path that is overloaded, such as central offices for that might route voice calls during an emergency, that you have a different way of getting to them. Maybe it's SMS, maybe it's email, maybe it's this mobile member application that I mentioned before, because that uses multiple ways of trying to get to that end user, typically via a push notification or whatnot. So as long as you have multiple ways of reaching people, what you're actually doing in that case is lessening the burden on the overall infrastructure by spreading it over multiple redundant paths of getting to that same people. And again, that information that's coming back can leverage the exact same path and typically provide for a much more reliable way of not only reaching out to people, but also accounting for them, because that's what's key. If you can get that information back from citizens, you know that they've received that overall message, they've responded, whether they need help or not. It actually helps reduce dramatically the burden on the communications infrastructures, because you know they've received it. You don't have to try to communicate with them again unless the information changes. Whereas in an environment where you don't know what's going on, or there is no two-way communication, you can't make that assumption. So you might be sending the exact information to people all over again, instead of reducing it with every attempt to just those people from whom you didn't get an acknowledgement.
Okay, so I think this next question is for Dr. Chandler, and I'll actually combine two questions here. Our friend David in New Zealand said that after the Christchurch earthquake, there's still a lot of residual mental health issues. Is there any benefit to citizens participating in this feedback process? And then there's a follow-up question that says, do you create an obligation to a citizen who is placing themselves in danger by using their info but not telling them to get out of danger?
Thanks for the question, David. My normal disclaimers are I'm neither a psychotherapist nor a lawyer, so both of your questions, I will give you an opinion, and you certainly should consult them. One of the things that we've learned in terms of psychological, emotional, cognitive recovery after these events is that involvement and some kinds of remedial steps are yes, they're very, very important. Generally, we talk about talk, tears, and time is the most common thing that we do in terms of getting people back into some sense of resiliency. Talk, obviously, we talk one-on-one, you talk in small groups, you do large talk. Talking about it is just almost a ubiquitous form of recovery therapy. Tears, you give people a chance to acknowledge the shock, the pain, the grief, the stuff that we bundle up. And of course, time is a remarkable thing for perspective building and allows some elasticity there. We use an approach, and actually I didn't cover it in today's webinar. I do a separate training program on psychological first aid and some things that you can do to help with that recovery process. And I do think there are some techniques, and I won't go too much into them because of time limitations in this question thing. But I do think that post area from the Christchurch earthquake is an excellent example. In fact, we had at our conference 2 years ago a group that came all the way here to Orlando and shared with us some of the things they were doing in the post-earthquake for the recovery. And there's some remarkable things. You hold a music festival there now in the community, and there's some wonderful musical therapy that's being tried. And there's actually a radio program that's devoted to that. I'm trying to remember who carries that there. But yes, there's a lot of approaches. In terms of obligations, I don't think that you create any imperative. There's certainly no legal or other imperative of an obligation. I think what we're talking about here is for those in the wider spread public of just tapping what's there. Once they decide to stop and take a picture of the fire or post a tweet about how hard it is to find a facility. For example, in the Christchurch earthquake, social media was remarkable. What is the young fellow's name? He went around and tweeted and posted on social media where all of the porta potties were, the working toilets, and became a role model for how that information could then be utilized. The fact that they post it, I mean, certainly you're not compelling them to post it. The question is it useful for your workers who are going around the city trying to restore gas lines or repair electrical lines or working on telephone lines or internet connections or roads or, building inspectors, using that now as information of, hey, these are where the functioning toilets are once you enter the area, could be very useful. So I don't think you create any obligation for it. I think you're capturing information that has been placed in the public domain. Again, that said, I'm not an attorney, so lawyers will probably cringe with me. I do think once it's there, though, you have a question of whether or not to take advantage of it, and that comes to a due diligence obligation. And so it's not really an obligation on them, but it's just simply due diligence. If the information is there and you're choosing not to adopt a system to let you access it, have you really done due diligence to let people know? And that's a good question. Of course, within your private networks, yes. If you're sending workers out doing those things, if those smaller circles, and that's part of their job, then yes, you've compelled them to do that. So if they're your employees who are out there repairing internet connections or water pipes or whatever they're doing, then, and you're saying we also want you to post it and tweet it, then yeah, then I guess there is some sense of obligation. I hope that answers your question, David, and thank you for joining us from down under.
Thank you, Dr. Chandler. So we have a lot of great questions coming in. I know we're a little bit over the time, but I wanted to just have one more question for our panelists. Can you comment on the need for network reliability and what to do if the network fails? Especially since video and photo files take huge bandwidth, how do you ensure systems stay open for first responders?
I'll let Imad handle the technical question.
Okay, thank you for that one. Yes, so actually that is a key point. So again, I mean, I'll go back to one of the similar response that I had before. The fact is, what you're doing here is making sure that you're first and foremost communicating with the people who are out there in the line of fire, right? And in order to do that, what you are going to have to do is communicate with them in as many different ways as possible. You can never say that, you know what, keep everybody off the phone line because we need these phone calls to go through. It's no longer something that is really feasible. But what you can do in this case is say, look, for Joe out there, I have an email address, I have a phone number for their landline, one for their cell phone. I'm going to try an SMS. And again, the more ways I have of reaching them, the higher the likelihood that I will be able to get to. As far as the information, coming back from people, but let's face it, a lot of people are going to be going ahead and posting things to social media. What we're doing here is simply leveraging the information that they're already providing across the board to these public forums and simply making use of it in a much, much more automated way. Right, again, looking for clusters from a geographic perspective, things that have been already geotagged, or analyzing the frequency of certain keywords within certain hashtags, etc., and then augmenting it with other information that's coming in. That is not going to cause any more, shall we say, a burden, because they were going to be doing that anyway. Right, so but when you're dealing with potentially a more a closed network, like creating your own community with our mobile application, well, part of what we do there is make sure that, once again, what's happening is that the applications themselves are pretty resilient as far as working under adverse network conditions, both for sending things out as well as for bringing information back. So part of it is by making sure they do as much work on the client side as possible, so they don't have to download the UI, etc. So they can start up pretty much immediately because they're resident on the smartphones. And also, when you're dealing with something like a connection to a smartphone application, that it can also use the best possible method that it has to acquire an IP endpoint. So for the member application, for example, yes, it might connect to a cell phone tower and get an internet connection that way, but in many cases, it's just like what we saw during the Boston Marathon events. In some cases, the most reliable connections were actually through public and corporate Wi-Fi networks, and it was able to piggyback on whichever one was best in this particular case to send the richer information. And then the richer information tends to be sent in such a way that it's a little bit optimized and use less bandwidth than it otherwise would in that particular case. But one way or the other, you've got to be able to basically say, when we're dealing with crisis situations, relying on a single way, whether it's phone calls or whether it's text or whether it's email, whatever it is, the fewer ways you have of reaching somebody in either direction, the higher the likelihood that you will not when things go south. So, and when you talk about network availability, again, we're dealing with multiple networks here, and the more diversity you have, the higher the likelihood that you can be resilient from a systems perspective.
Great, thank you so much. And so I am very sorry to announce that we've run out of time. I thank everyone for staying a few extra minutes with us. And just as a reminder, if your question wasn't answered during this session, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the webinar. So thank you, Dr. Chandler and Ahmad, for a great session. If you missed any part of the webinar, be sure to look for the slides on blog.everbridge.com. And you'll also receive an email with a link to the recording in the coming days. If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter at Everbridge and join our group on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management and Emergency Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a demo of the new Everbridge system, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. And thank you again for your participation in today's presentation on the resiliency of society, how critical communications guide citizen response in a crisis. We hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day.